Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The U.S. has redesignated the Houthi militant group as a terrorist organization after months of their attacks on ships in the Red Sea. Last week, the U.S. and the U.K., in response, launched the airstrikes on Houthi military installations, expecting the move to de-escalate the situation. But the Houthis have said they won't stop until the attacks on Palestinians in Gaza have ceased. What more do we know about the Houthi group? Could the Western retaliation only serve to escalate the conflict? And what role can the UN and other regional actors play in restoring peace in the region? Join us for our discussion live today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Glenn Deason from the University of Southeastern Norway, Ford Izadi, Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Tehran, Wang Jian, Associate Professor at Northwest University of China, and Professor Robert Kelly from the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University. Welcome to Dialogue. Well, Glenn, I will start with you. So the military operation by the U.S. and the U.K., we can see that there was effort, I would say, from the U.S. side to invite more U.S. allies to join the military operation against Houthis. But ultimately, it's the U.S. and the U.K. Leading the attacks. Why is their hesitation, from their allies, for example, from European countries?
Well, I think it's a variety of concerns. For one, this is seen as an extension of the conflict in Gaza, and as it becomes more and more likely that what's happening in Gaza now is in fact a genocide, it's concerned that this could make them accomplices in a genocide. But of course, the Israelis are trying to pull in the Americans into this war as well, and the Americans would like to pull in the Europeans so it doesn't stand all alone. That being said, I think there's also a huge concern that this conflict can really go out of hand now, because there's so many different scenarios in which this becomes a much wider regional conflict. And simply put, in Europe, there's very little appetite for a major war, as we're already fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. So it's many would like to avoid this.
Yeah, many would like to avoid this, but in any sense, the move or the military attack, the bombing from the U.S. and the U.K. has been accused of the lack of legitimacy or being counterproductive. So Wang Jian, is that the case?
Sure, of course, because maybe from the perspective of the United States or the UK, actually they are doing the things to show their capabilities to deter the Houthi attacks and to prevent the further attacks from Houthi to the passing vessels with the close connections with Israel, now with the United States and UK. But then we have to know that I think the United States, they have different measures that could be taken to do the things to protect the vessels rather than just attack the targets inside Yemen, especially the Yemen Houthi-controlled areas. Because we know that some European countries, they are also planning to organize a kind of the international fleet. But I think their measures to protect the passing vessels is, on the one hand, to show the very defensive measures, right, rather than a very, very provocative and attactive measure. And on the other thing, I think they hope to try to establish the very, very direct or indirect communication channel with Houthi government or the Houthi regime, given the fact that now only the military talking or the military ways can just provoke and escalate the tension. But then if the political communication channel started with more and more direct and indirect talks and negotiation just to get inside, I think the situation in this region might be de-escalated from the ongoing tension and ongoing war to a more pacified direction. So I think that is very highly needed now.
Well, Robert, if you look at the U.S. response, by bombing, for example, the military sites inside Yemen, of course, controlled by Houthi, the regions, the areas. Do you think this is the right response to the Houthi attacks on the commercial ships in the Red Sea? Do people really think that attacks like this will help deter the Houthis from continuing such, let's say, harassment?
Yeah, I don't think that the attacks will really deter the Houthi strikes. I think a lot of it is motivated, as your previous guest mentioned. I think a lot of it is motivated by the wider conflict that's sort of growing in the Middle East, and the ideological splits, and the Houthis are reflecting that. I would be surprised if the Houthis didn't continue to strike, and I would be surprised, quite honestly, if it didn't continue to escalate. I would imagine the Americans will strike harder. President Biden said that when he was asked yesterday, I think, right, that the strikes will continue. And my own sense is that these are actually, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that it's sort of part of the wider conflict between Israel and Hamas. But I think also there's a basic sort of like anti-piracy sort of public goods provision element to this too, which is to say that, right, it's not really clear that the Houthis are actually doing much on behalf of the Palestinians by striking international shipping. A lot of that actually impacts Asian and European consumers and producers. So you can make the argument the United States is actually providing a public service here insofar as it's permitting the continuation of this trade, which all parties in Eurasia actually have an interest in, right? Whether or not it'll actually stop the Houthis, I don't know. My guess is no, that it won't, but it's not clear to me that this is actually going to do much to the Palestinians. I think it's motivated by them, but by sympathy for them, but it's not clear to me that this is actually directly impacting or really doing very much for the Palestinian cause, because really what it's really doing is driving up costs for consumers in East Asia and Europe, and the linkage is thin, I think.
Where the linkage is thin. Professor Izzadi, how organized were the Houthis? Their goal, or their talked about goal, is to pressure Israel, to pressure the United States from, say, pausing the bombing of Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza region. How much do we know about their capability and their targets, or what's the final goal?
As your first guest said, we have a genocide in Gaza. We have the United States and UK and a number of European countries that are providing the arms for this genocide. And under international law, states have a responsibility to protect civilians when we face genocide or war crimes. It's very obvious what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is genocide. If anybody has any doubts, they can go to 88 pages of documentation by South Africa that was presented at the International Court of Justice just a few days ago. And in 2005, United Nations World Assembly adopted this resolution, responsibility to protect. So when states see genocide going on, they have a responsibility to act. They are not supposed to aid the side that's engaging in genocide. That's what the United States and UK are doing. They are not supposed to be watching a genocide going on. That's not what states are supposed to do. They're supposed to use their capacities, capabilities to stop the genocide. And this is what the Yemenis are doing. They're not targeting international shipping. They're targeting Israeli ships. They're targeting ships that are going to Israel. They are trying to damage Israel economically, and they have been quite successful. These are Western media reports that 80% of the shipping is going as before. Only 20% of the shipping is affected. What the US and UK are doing is that they say that if Israeli ships cannot pass through Bab al-Mandab, then they are going to create a war against international law. We don't have any UN Security Council resolution asking anybody to attack Yemen, and that's what they are doing. So what the Yemenis are doing is following international law, and US and UK, as usual, are acting in criminal ways, and this is the history of these
Professor
two countries.
Izzadi, how much can these attacks, let's say attacks on the Israel-related shipping, and how can these attacks deter U.S. and Western support of Israel, or to pressure Israel to stop the bombing in Gaza?
We have had Israelis advertising to Zionists all over the world to come to Palestine because they're going to get free land, they're going to get free money, they're going to get housing, they're going to get all types of goodies. And the idea is to make sure that this promise is not fulfilled. this is other people's land. It's called Palestine. It belongs to the Palestinians. The occupation needs to end. And when you put economic pressure on Israelis, they realize that the promises that they were given to come and take other people's land without any difficulty is not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly what Yemenis are doing, and this should be a responsibility of other countries. You know, Chinese ships, Russian ships, other countries are going through the Red Sea without any problem. They are waved in without any difficulties. Only Israelis are targeted, and since the attack of US and UK,
that's
American and British ships also.
Right. Let's take a look at the other side of the story here. Of course, similarly, Robert, you can ask the question, whether these attacks by the US and the UK will they be enough to weaken Houthis or to deter Houthis from launching further attacks against the international shipping or say ships or vessels to or from Israel?
Will it succeed? Yeah, that's actually a really good question. It's not really clear. My sense is it will probably take more force for the Americans and the British and the coalition to actually get the Houthis to back off. Right? I mean, Yemen is pretty big, right? There's a lot of space for the targets, the missiles, the launchers to be moved around. Right, it's not clear if the United States has great intelligence on where exactly to strike. Yemen's had sort of civil conflict for a long time, so it should be pretty clear that that the Houthis can survive. You may recall, for example, back in Afghanistan in 2001, right, the bombing is not what drove out the Taliban. Eventually, the United States had to support a local ground force, the Northern Alliance, and then send in U.S. forces as well. So it's not really clear that airstrikes are actually going to, really do that much to change Yemeni politics. It might slow down the strikes a little bit if the United States gets particularly powerful intelligence or particularly accurate intelligence, but that's probably hard to come by in a really fragmented environment like Yemen. So again, I think your guest and I all share sort of this concern, right, that this is probably going to escalate. Right. I would imagine actually in time, the way this will probably end up finishing is that international shipping will find that even if the Americans and the British are trying to keep the sea lane open, it will simply be too risky and they'll start going the longer route. And eventually the problem will sort of resolve itself insofar as the shipping will simply move away from the target zone because, the Red Sea is pretty narrow. Right. And so it's just easier eventually, right, to send your ships around the Cape rather than going through a war zone. Right, especially if this sort of expands, as I think a lot of people expect it to do. So I would imagine that the problem will eventually be resolved simply by market forces, which is to say that companies won't want to send their goods through the Red Sea any further.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, if you look at the military capability, the U.S., the U.K., of course, are way more powerful than the Houthis. But the situation is like they don't need to be having a balanced power, against the U.S. or U.K. As long as there continued attacks either against the Israeli-related shipping or international shipping, that's enough to create, say, the sense of insecurity in the Red Sea.
Yeah, I think so, because they don't rely on a traditional military infrastructure. Keep in mind that Yemen has already been under attack by the United States through its Saudi proxy for many years. But again, I think success depends how you measure it. What they want to do is put economic pressure on the United States and Israel, as well as others who support this. Now, I would say that what Yemen is doing is already having an effect, even if their missiles and drones are shot down. Because what you see is they use fairly cheap drones and missiles, and Americans and British have to have very expensive interceptor missiles to shoot them down. Furthermore, you even see that a huge part of the traffic has been disrupted, which will have, of course, consequences as well. So this has also been effective. Doesn't mean they have to sink every ship. That doesn't really, I don't think success have to be measured along those indicators. And I think you may also see, maybe in the future, being able to hit one of the warships as well. So I think, you can see the disruption to trade and economic pressure on Israel. But also it can be seen success in the form of mobilizing the public in the region. Keep in mind that many of the governments in the region while they do not like the genocide that the Israelis are carrying out, they're very careful and don't want to get too involved in this. But if you look at the public, they're quite furious. And at the moment, no one is seen to stand up for the Palestinians, even though a genocide is being carried out in their own neighborhood. But what you see now is the poorest country in the region, Yemen, where they're actually standing up against the United States and Israel. It can help to mobilize some of the public in the region as well, which puts greater pressure on the political leadership. So I wouldn't dismiss the Houthis in Yemen just because they obviously don't have the same capabilities as the United States. But again, in guerrilla warfare, you have some advantages as well to the weaker part.
Yeah, of course, the danger is the potential escalation or even dragging into the crisis more actors, including regional actors. Wang Jin, the concern is, of course, there's a belief or there's, basically reports saying that Iran is behind the Houthis, providing training, providing weapons. But also at the same time, we do hear the Iranian officials saying that, they want peace and security of the international shipping in the Red Sea. So what's the Iranian response to the airstrikes by the US and UK, and similarly to the attacks by Houthi in the Red Sea?
I think Iran played a very rational and constructive role during the past days in the conflict between Yemen, Houthi, and United States and UK fleet. Because a lot of talkings, as you mentioned, or some reports maintain that Iran keeps very close ties, or maybe describes the Houthi as Iran's satellite actor in the Red Sea. And on the other hand, some may say, okay, Iran has no direct connections with Houthi, and they are just two separate actors. I think the real situation is much more complicated, because on one hand, we know that Iran, of course, they provided some kind of assistance to the Yemen Houthi, for example. They might share some intelligence cooperation, and they might share some kind of military training cooperation. Yes, that might be true. But on the other hand, we have to know that the two actors, Iran on the one hand and Yemen Houthi on the other hand, they are actually very separated from each other, both politically and also geographically. Even that when we are talking about they share the very similar Shia, Islamic branch, but actually inside the Shia branch, they are two different types and two different branches. Although they all belong to the whole big Shia family, but actually their religious belief system are very, very different. So we cannot say that Iran is Houthi and Houthi is Iran. And during the past days, as I mentioned, that the wars between Yemen Houthi and United States and UK fleet in the Red Sea, Iran, on the one hand, they called for the very rational actions of both sides, and also on the other hand, we didn't witness the growing assistance and the growing intervention of Iran into the Red Sea crisis. If Iran really want to do something, really want to attack and launch the new waves of attacks against the United States targets and UK targets in the region, including in the Red Sea, they could easily do it. But then we didn't see that Iran really launched such kind of a wave of attack. And also Iran still keeps the voice for peace, keeps the voice claim for more rational move in the future. So I think Iran will continue to do this way, to play the very constructive role in the region with the hope to bring back the opportunities of peace to the region, including Houthi and United States and UK in this region.
Well, speak of that, Wang Jin, of course, the people will ask, what about the Iranian strikes, airstrikes at targets inside Iraq, inside Syria, inside Pakistan? For example, of course, there's a strong response from Pakistani side. What do you make of that?
I think, yes, if we look at the whole region, Iran is also in the Middle East, and the targets in Syria, the targets in Iraq, as you mentioned, and also the targets in Pakistan, they could be considered as a greater Middle East area. So of course, this looks like that the fire is burning everywhere in the whole area. But then we have to know that Iran's attacks during the past days to the targets into Syria, into the Iraqi Kurdish automatic region, and also in the Pakistan, and also the Pakistan retaliation actions against the Iranian targets inside Iran territory. They are the consequential results of the earlier terrorist attack in Kurdiman inside Iran. So that is Iran's retaliation efforts. So they targets the efforts, targets this kind of the so-called terrorist group, Islamic State. There are branches in Syria. There are some kind of the channels and some targets in Iraq, and also some targets in Pakistan. This is the retaliation efforts from Iran to show their strength, to show their anger, to pacify their own anger and dissatisfaction of their people inside their home. So I don't think it has very direct connection with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and also has very direct connection with the Red Sea crisis. So I think this is just another kind of the very, very consequential results of what is happening earlier inside Iran, rather than Iran's efforts to further provoke the regional tension and the crisis.
Okay. Professor Izzadi, of course, the Biden administration has re-designated the Houthi group as an SDGT, so-called SDGT, especially designated global terrorists, which is just one level, of course, less than being designated as, basically the terrorist group. So what tell us, what kind of impact that will have on the Houthis? At the same time, people have concern whether that will affect this humanitarian assistance to Yemeni people in the region.
Yemen is not a rich country. There are a lot of people that are suffering in Yemen. They experienced 8 years of war from the Saudi side, bombing Yemen. But Yemenis have this thing called culture of resistance. Culture of resistance. That means that they need to act in a way to protect their country, and they have been doing that. And as your previous guest said, they are also helping the Palestinians, who are also under pressure and are facing genocide. And this culture of resistance is something that Palestinians have, Yemenis have, Iranians have, Lebanese have. The United States, UK, Israel are engaging in war crimes as we speak in this part of the world. And people of this region have understood that the only way to protect themselves is to resist this type of pressures. And as you know, they are getting stronger under pressure. If you compare Yemenis' capabilities today to 8 years ago, they are actually stronger today than 8 years ago, because culture of resistance works. And what the United States is doing is pressuring Yemenis civilians because they are not following US dictates. And they're doing the same thing with Iranian civilians and Lebanese civilians and other civilians in this part of the world. The message that the United States has is that either you follow our orders or we'll call you a terrorist. True terrorists are Netanyahu and his cabinet. They should be designated as terrorists, not the Yemenis.
Very different opinions there. Robert, of course, ultimately it seems, a lot of these clashes or tensions is, obviously it's about the Gaza situation. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has recently refused the U.S. call of stopping the military operation in Gaza. He also rejected the idea of having an independent Palestinian state, incurring condemnation from Washington, the White House. So there's so much the U.S. can do vis-a-vis Israel. What's next? Is there lack of a willingness, political willingness on the part of Washington to apply pressure on Israel to really change the situation?
Yeah, I think for the short term, yes, that's correct. I think it's pretty clear that there's a pretty strong elite consensus in the United States behind Israel right now, even in this particular moment, right, when there's a lot of sort of pushback. But I do think that the coalition behind Israel in the United States is fracturing, particularly on the left. It's pretty clear from all the protests out there that the Democratic Party, which has traditionally supported Israel in the United States, is changing. And I think in time, as the Democratic leadership, which is older these days, as they are changed out, as they retire and are replaced by a younger group, I think there will be more and more pressure, at least on the American left, to change America's position about Israel. I think on the right, I think in American right-wing American politics, conservative American politics, actually I think that support will deepen, because a lot of American Israeli support is wrapped up with, to be honest, sort of Christian American fundamentalist ideology, and that's really not going to change, right? And Donald Trump really relies on those evangelical Christian voters as the core of his base, and they very strongly support this. So Israel and the United States, the short answer is Israel and the United States is becoming a highly partisan issue, and I think that will become worse in time in the future, which is to say the Republican Party will support Israel, and increasingly the Democratic Party will have qualms about things like what you're seeing in Gaza right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, this thing, of course, another major part is the European nations here. Their stance in terms of the Gaza conflict here, you do see some cracks, or differences rising between nations in the European continent. So some nations are very critical of the Israeli, what they do in the Gaza. Some others, they stand firmly behind Israel. What is the situation? Which direction is it moving? Glenn.
Oh, sorry. Well, I think that the Europeans, they're walking back some of their initial support because the Europeans are very dependent on the United States, especially these days. So they tend to follow in the US lead. Also, there has always been a strong, almost autopilot to support Israel. So, of course, when the 7th of October attacks on Israel, there was a huge outcry. Everyone committed themselves to this unconditional support for Israel. But then when the Israeli retaliation came and it became evident they're not only going after Hamas, but they're pursuing, first it seemed genocide, ethnic cleansing to push the population out, and then now it seems more this is a genocide instead. I think there's more who's become more and more concerned and would like to, reduce this unconditional support, which is also, I think, one of the reasons why the Europeans are less willing to join this, American coalition of the willing, if you will, to have legitimacy for striking Yemen. And I think there's also worries about where Israel will take this conflict as well as the United States, because the Middle East now, it can explode at any time. Besides the Red Sea, the Israelis and the Americans could strike Lebanon, and that would be set the whole region on fire. Also, we've seen what the retaliations are against the United States, and I guess the Europeans who do not want the same. That is, there's been attacks on U.S. occupation forces in Syria and Iraq. Former guest here mentioned Iran's ballistic missile attack on these U.S. and Israeli assets in northern Iraq, which had been behind the terrorist attack in Iran. And of course, Egypt could be pulled into this as well if Israel attempts to push the Palestinians across the border. So there's so many ways that this conflict can get out of control that I think for the Europeans they still support the Israelis, especially Germany, because of their historic guilt. But more countries, I think, is shifting. But also within the countries, I think the younger generation, they're carrying less of this historic guilt, if you will, and they're more sympathetic, I think, to the Palestinians, and do not necessarily see the logic why in Europe we have to provide support for this genocide. So again, there's a lot of signs from the United States that this is something we don't want. Look at what the new nicknames of the American president is, Genocide Joe, Butcher Biden. This is not something that many Europeans would like to stay in their own countries. Of course, not for anyone, of course. In the EU, we have people like von der Leyen, who's been very, very outspoken about her support for Israel. And I think that this will come back and undermine her own position in the long run. So again, I think it's just too much uncertainty, given that both Israel and the United States might actually even take this conflict all the way to Iran, right, with this allegation that somehow the Houthis, everyone's are their puppets. So yeah, I think the Europeans are becoming very worried about this.
Well, with that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.